Over the last couple of years, I have played both Metroid Dread and the Metroid Prime Remaster, and these have sort of served as my introduction, properly anyway, to the Metroid series. I did like Dread a bit more, but I enjoyed both of them enough that it got me curious about playing the rest of the series. Now, I had played Metroid Fusion on the Game Boy Advance as a kid, but I'd never really got very far with it, and so I decided to give it another go as my next game in the Metroid series. So, as somebody who's not completely new but not a veteran to the Metroid series, here are my thoughts on Metroid Fusion. Hello and welcome back to the channel. So I've given you a bit of an idea of my history with the Metroid series, but I was really excited to undertake another of Samus's adventures and to hopefully finally put to bed one of the old Game Boy Advance games that I'd never got around to finishing. You can play Metroid Fusion on the Nintendo Switch online service, but I didn't really want to play it on, like a bigger screen and holding a bigger console in my hands. I kind of wanted something a bit smaller. I do actually still have my Metroid Fusion cartridge, the Game Boy Advance cartridge, but my actual Game Boy Advance is waiting on a few repairs, so I couldn't play it on there. So in the end, I decided to play it on my Anbernic RG35XX. The screen is really good for playing Game Boy games, I think, and with the ability to sleep and resume multiple games at once, it meant I could sort of dip in and out of some Metroid whenever I wanted to. And after a few videos ago saying that I would never ever want to buy an HDMI output cable for this device, I bought an HDMI output cable for this device purely so that I could record the gameplay directly for this video. So when I first started playing Metroid Fusion, my very first impressions, I suppose, of the game were that it still looked really nice. I'm a big fan of pixel art anyway. That's one of my favorite styles of, graphics in games. I talked about this a little bit with Pokemon. And I also think that it just ages a bit better than 3D rendering, and I think it holds up really nicely in Metroid Fusion. Sure, some of the text could use a bit of a resolution bump, but I got used to that pretty quickly, I think, and then everything else looks really good. Character models look great, monsters look ugly and scary when they need to. It's got some great colors to it as well. When I was younger, I did play this game a little bit, but I ended up dropping it quite quickly, and that was because it pretty much just scared me out of playing it. And going back now, even as an adult, I can kind of understand why that happened. As Samus, you're alone on this space station. The music likes to build up and it really builds suspense as well. It's got a really creepy soundtrack. You don't know who the bad guy is yet. The game is really good at keeping you in the dark towards the start of it where you're not really sure what's going on. It makes you feel more and more paranoid about what's going to happen. And then pretty close to the start of the game, this happens. Is it over? Okay, joking aside, I did remember this scene was coming, and actually my fear of when the scene was going to happen actually ended up being more than how scary the scene was. But as a kid, this absolutely terrified me. And the thing is, it's not the only scary part of the game. The evil Samus, or the SAX, is said to be constantly looking for you throughout the station. It's hunting for you, trying to find you, but at the same time, you are told over and over that you're not strong enough to fight it yet. At certain scripted times, you do come across it in game. At first, at a distance, you're never really in any real danger, but it's still scary because you don't realize that at the time, and you're kind of worried if it's going to spot you at all. And also, just the sound of those footsteps will forever haunt me. Eventually you will come face to face with it, and to start with, all you can do is run away from this far superior foe. And very often you will die once or twice while you're trying to work out the best way to run away, how you get through that wall or past it. Once you have ice rockets, you can freeze it, but that doesn't really make you feel better. It's still a pretty scary thing for a Game Boy game. And all of this is accompanied by a pretty unsettling soundtrack. Just as an example, here is some of the music that can play after a pretty nasty reveal in the story. I don't really play horror games at all, and I don't watch horror movies. I'm far too big of a chicken. And I think it says a lot that the developers managed to bring the same feeling out in me from, a 2D game on a very, very small screen. I think they did a really good job with that sort of that atmosphere and that tension, that horror feeling. Blah, it's too scary for me, but I did persevere, partly for the video and also partly because I wanted to find out what was going on in the story. So at the start of Metroid Fusion, Samus is infected by a parasite known only as the X. This basically shuts her down and she's only saved by the introduction of Metroid DNA to her blood, which works because Metroids are the natural predators of the X. However, Samus is left in a very, very weakened state compared to when she's at full power. Soon after that, there's a big explosion on the space station and Samus is sent out to find out what it is that's going on. It's pretty quickly revealed that the big bad is the aforementioned SAX, which I assume stands for Samus Aran X, but it never really says. And it turns out that the SAX formed from the infected parts of Samus's suit, which was sent off to the space station for investigation. The X sort of used that to take her form because that's one of the X's latent abilities. They can take the form of anything that they sort of absorb into. From there, the game really is a case of trying to stop the X from escaping the space station whilst at the same time powering up Samus to eventually be able to take on greater and greater foes and hopefully stop the SAX. But there are a few extras thrown in every now and then. It's a pretty old game now, so I'm going into spoilers. I particularly liked the twists thrown in with the Federation. Towards the end, they started to hold back power upgrades from Samus because they didn't want it to get too powerful and destroy the SAX. Instead, they wanted to, examine it. They were hoping to be able to contain it and, unleash it on the pirates of the galaxy, I suppose. I'm not really sure. And I also thought it was really cool finding the secret Metroid lab that the Federation were using. They were trying to experiment on Metroid growth and see if they could bring about Omega Metroids much more quicker than they would form naturally. The story being delivered by text on the screen, mostly from the AI from the space station, it didn't really distract from it. I was always really interested to see what Adam had to say whenever I was being debriefed next. So I did enjoy the story a lot, but I think the other key aspect of a Metroid game is the gameplay, and without the gameplay being good, I feel like a Metroid game would sort of fall on its knees. But I'm happy to say that I think this holds up well even today. Dread was the Metroid game that I fully completed first, and so I was a little bit worried that this would feel like a step back. Dread was so smooth and slick, it felt so nice to move Samus around, you had to slide, that kind of thing. And sure, in some ways this game, it does feel like a step back, but it doesn't feel as much of a step back as I thought it would. Sure, I do miss the slide, but I kind of got used to that pretty quickly, and the movement feels pretty good, to be honest. Jumping from platform to platform, you don't really get any weird problems with positioning or speed or anything like that. It's pretty easy to go back and forth. I did find it a bit awkward using L and R for rockets and diagonal aiming, but that might more be because I played it on a vertical handheld rather than anything else. But for some bosses that you especially needed a lot of rockets for, I did come away from those with, a bit of hand cramp from constantly holding the R button. I have seen complaints that this is quite a linear Metroid game, but I think for me personally that kind of worked out in the game's favour. After how open and confusing I found the second half to the end of Metroid Prime Remastered, I actually quite liked that in this game I pretty much always knew where I was going. There was the occasional puzzle to work out to figure out where you're going next, and most of the time I found these really satisfying actually. The developers often left clues onto how to, solve where it was that you needed to go next, and actually completing some of these puzzles and figuring out where to go without using a guide, it was pretty rewarding. It did feel very good actually. There was still a couple of times when I ended up having to look up where I was supposed to go because I just couldn't figure out at all. One point where you're supposed to go through a bit of a maze in Morph Ball form that I don't think I would ever have figured out, that there was like a tiny gap there that you couldn't see. I don't know how anybody did it without the internet, so if you played this through when it first came out and you got all the way through without using the internet to look things up because it didn't exist back then well done to you. One of the big spectacles of the Metroid games, of course, is the boss fights, and I enjoyed these quite a lot in Fusion as well. The first few, I will say, I actually found a bit too easy, but then basically from the second half of the game onwards, the bosses got really, really hard. They really challenged me. I know the bosses all have names, but I don't know any of the names, so things like the spider boss and the plant boss, they were quite tricky until you basically figured out the right position to stand to avoid most of their attacks, and from there it sort of got a bit easier. But then the final few bosses, things like the Nightmare and Ridley and the SAX itself, they all took me quite a lot of attempts to beat. They were pretty difficult, I will say. I'm not necessarily the best at challenging games, but I also don't feel like I'm bad at games either. I feel like I've been playing them for long enough that I'm pretty good, but yeah, I found these pretty challenging. And I will say that these 3 end bosses in particular made me quite happy to be using my RG35XX, because I could use save states to jump straight back into the bosses when I lost every time. A lot of these towards the end didn't seem to have save points near to the boss, so I can't imagine how annoying it would have been to constantly have to run back to the room to fight the boss, to die, to run back to the room. I did that a couple of times for each one, and then I was just like, no, I need to use save states, otherwise I'm just going to go mad. So that's maybe something that I would say is a bit of a negative to this, and I think nowadays that kind of thing happens less and less, where you lose to a hard boss and you have to go all the way back. Maybe Dark Souls or something like that. But these days, normally hard bosses have respawn points pretty close to them. Eventually though, you do beat the SAX, you set the space station on a collision course with a planet, end up fighting an Omega Metroid while you try to escape with the help of the SAX, which you then end up absorbing and make your escape. I was a little confused why the SAX actually helps you. At first I thought maybe it was just trying to get to your ship to escape as well, but then afterwards I kind of thought, well, if its objective was to just leave and it could fly the ship, then why didn't it do that right from the very start? So I don't think it was trying to get to the ship. I think I've decided that I believe it was because the Metroids are the natural predators of the X, so it just fought the thing that it was most scared of. I think that's probably what they were going for. I did really like the way the game sort of ended, with Samus having defied the Federation, you know, killing the SAX, destroying the space station. I was sort of left wondering if there would be any consequences for that, you know, for Samus's actions, but I don't really remember anything being addressed at the start of Metroid Dread, so I'm guessing not, but I did end up wondering about that. All in all, I had a really good time with Metroid Fusion, and one thing I noticed was that the further into the game I got, the longer my playtime sessions ended up being. I recorded the whole thing and I sort of noticed that towards the start I was playing for maybe 20 minutes, and then it would get to 30, and then towards the end, the last few times I was recording, it was like an hour at a time, because I was just enjoying it. I wanted to beat the boss, or I wanted to see what was happening in the story. And also I think the game is more fun when you get more powers. Towards the start obviously you feel quite weak, and the more powers you get, the more things open up, and I think the more fun you have with that. After I finished the game, I even went back and looked up a few things about Dread, just to refresh my knowledge about exactly what it was that happened next, just because I enjoyed Fusion enough and it got me interested again. So what do you think? Are you a fan of Metroid Fusion? Where does it rank in the series for you? I'm quite interested to play more of these now, although I'm not really sure which one next. I realise that I'm playing them out of order. You know, I played Metroid Dread, which is Metroid 5, and then I've played Metroid Fusion, which is Metroid 4. But I don't really think it matters too much. I've not felt like I've missed a lot of the story really by playing them out of order. I think I've still got Samus Returns on the 3DS and Metroid Zero Mission again on the GBA to play, and then I might have played them all. No, that can't be right actually, because Metroid Fusion is Metroid 4, and I've played 4 and 5, so there's 1, 2, 3, but I can only think of 2 games that I've yet to play, so I must be missing one somewhere. Help! If you've got any suggestions for which one I should play next, let me know. And also if you'd be interested to see me playing more on the channel, maybe I could go through the whole series on the channel. If you'd enjoy that, then just pop a comment down below. Would you like to see more of these games on the channel? Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and I really hope to see you in the next one.